They laughed the day he buried his own cabin. Not quietly, not behind his back, right there in the open, standing in the snow, boots crunching over frozen ground as they watched him smear wet clay across solid timber like a man who had lost his sense. Ruining good wood, one of them muttered. Sealing himself in a mud tomb, another added. And then came the louder ones, the kind meant to carry. He thinks dirt will keep the cold out. The laughter followed. It rolled across the valley, bouncing between cabins built the way they always had been, stacked logs, tight seams, smoke pushing steady from chimneys. And in the middle of it all stood Caleb Turner. Late 20s, lean, quiet, covered in clay up to his elbows. He didn't respond, didn't defend himself, didn't even look up. He just kept working, because what they saw wasn't what he was building. Not really. The cabin had started like any other. Solid log structure, tight joints, good timber. He wasn't careless. He wasn't inexperienced. He knew how to build the right way. That's why it bothered them. Because this wasn't ignorance. It was intentional. First, he packed clay between every seam of the logs, far more than necessary. Where others used thin chinking, Caleb filled the gaps deep, pressing the material in until it hardened like stone. Then he didn't stop. He coated the exterior, layer after layer. Wet clay slapped against the walls, smoothed by hand, thickened over time. It covered the logs completely, swallowing the texture of the wood until the cabin stopped looking like a cabin at all. It looked like a boulder. Rounded edges, uneven surface, earth-toned, dull, heavy. Snow didn't cling to it the same way. It dusted, then slid. Water didn't soak into seams, it ran. And still he kept going. He built it thicker. He shaped it. He sealed it. By the time the first frost came, there was barely any wood visible from the outside. Just earth. Just clay. Just something that looked wrong to every man who passed by. "You planning to live in that?" someone called one evening. Caleb paused, finally glancing up. "Through winter," he said. That only made them laugh harder. Because everyone in the valley knew what winter did. It didn't just test cabins. It exposed them. The cold here wasn't ordinary. It crept. It pressed. It found weakness in places a man didn't even know he had built wrong. And when it found it, it stayed. Inside walls. Inside floors. Inside bone. Clay, to them, wasn't protection. It was a mistake. Because clay got cold. Clay held cold. Clay froze. At least, that's what they believed. Caleb knew something different. He'd learned it years ago, long before he came to this valley. A place farther south. Less snow. More earth. He had worked with a man there. Old, quiet, patient. The kind who didn't explain things unless you were willing to watch first. That man had built homes that didn't fight the temperature. They absorbed it. Held it. Released it slowly. Wood reacts fast, the old man once said. Clay remembers. At the time, Caleb didn't fully understand. Not until he felt it. Not until he stepped inside one of those homes after sunset, when the heat of the day still lingered in the walls long after the fire had gone out. Not until he realized something simple. Fast heat wasn't the answer. Slow heat was. So when he came to this valley and heard the stories of winters that crushed even strong cabins, he didn't try to build stronger wood. He built something that wouldn't lose heat quickly in the first place. Thermal mass. Even if he never used the word. By the time winter arrived, his cabin didn't look like a cabin anymore. It looked like part of the land itself. Low, thick, solid. And when the first snowstorm rolled in, heavy and sudden, the valley barely noticed. At first, because early winter was always manageable. Fires burned. Chimneys smoked. Men worked. And Caleb? He lit a fire. Just one. Not large. Not aggressive. And then he waited. Inside the cabin, something quiet began to happen. The heat didn't rush out. It didn't flicker and fade the moment the fire dropped. It sank. Into the clay. Into the thickness of the walls. And instead of disappearing, it stayed. Not all at once. Not sharply. But steadily. By the time the fire died down, the warmth didn't vanish. It lingered. Holding inside the structure like it had nowhere else to go. The first few nights, Caleb barely slept. He watched. Measured by instinct, not numbers. How long the warmth lasted. How quickly the air cooled. How the walls felt under his palm. And every night, the same result. Slow loss. Not fast. Not dangerous. Controlled. By the time the second storm hit, the temperature dropped harder. And that's when the difference began. Across the valley, fires grew larger. Wood burned faster. Men woke in the middle of the night to feed flames that refused to hold steady heat. Cabins that had felt warm during the evening turned cold by morning. But Caleb's cabin didn't swing. It didn't spike and drop. It held. Inside, the air stayed stable. Not blazing hot, but comfortable. And more importantly, predictable. The kind of warmth that didn't disappear the moment you stopped feeding the fire. One night, a man named Willis passed by. He wasn't visiting. Not at first. He had been checking traps near the edge of the valley when the wind picked up faster than expected. Snow came sideways, thick enough to blind him. He saw the shape first. That strange, rounded structure that didn't look like anything else. Caleb's cabin. Willis hesitated. Then he moved toward it. Not because he believed in it, but because it was there. He knocked. The door opened, and the first thing he noticed was the difference. No sharp bite of cold slipping past the doorway. No sudden gust cutting through layers of clothing. Just still air. Warm air. He stepped inside without thinking, and immediately frowned. The fire was small. Too small. He turned, looking around. The walls weren't just coated, they were thick. Smooth. Dense. Like stone, but not. And the air, it wasn't fading. It wasn't fragile. It felt held. How? Willis asked. Caleb shrugged slightly. Doesn't leave as fast, he said. Willis didn't fully understand. But he didn't argue either. Because outside, the storm was building. And inside, something was working. He stayed longer than he meant to. And when he finally stepped back out into the cold, something had changed. Not in the weather, but in the way he looked at that cabin. The laughter didn't stop right away, but it started to fade. Because over the next few days, as the cold tightened its grip on the valley, people began to notice something strange. Caleb wasn't cutting wood as often. His fire didn't burn as high. And yet, his chimney never went cold. And his cabin never seemed to struggle. Not even when the temperature dropped further. Not even when the wind began to howl like it had something to prove. That's when the first real doubt crept in. And with it, curiosity. Because winter wasn't done yet. Not even close. Winter didn't break. It deepened. What had started as a hard season turned into something heavier, slower, more relentless. The kind of cold that didn't come in waves, but settled in and refused to leave. Days blurred into white. Nights stretched longer. And the valley began to feel it. Cabins that had held through the first storms started to fail. Not suddenly, but gradually. Heat slipped out faster than it could be replaced. Fires burned hotter, then died quicker. Wood piles shrank at a pace no one had planned for. Men adjusted the only way they knew how. They burned more. Fed the fire constantly. Stayed awake longer. But the pattern didn't change. Warmth rose fast and vanished just as fast. Inside Caleb Turner's cabin, the pattern never shifted. One fire. Low. Steady. The clay walls absorbed it through the evening, held it through the night, and gave it back slowly by morning. The temperature inside didn't spike. It stayed even. No frantic waking in the dark. No racing to keep the fire alive. Just consistency. And consistency was survival. It was Willis who came back first. This time, he didn't pretend it was coincidence. He knocked once, stepped in, and shut the door behind him quickly as the wind clawed at the outside. He stood there for a moment, letting the warmth settle into him. Then he looked at Caleb. "It doesn't drop, does it?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "Not fast enough to matter." Willis let out a quiet breath. That answer spread. Not as a story, as a realization. Because by the next morning, 2 more men came. By evening, 3. Not desperate yet, but close enough to ask questions instead of making jokes. They stood inside, studying the walls like they were trying to understand something they'd been missing all along. One of them ran his hand along the surface. "It's cold," he said. Caleb nodded. At first, the man frowned. Caleb walked over, placed his palm flat against the clay, and held it there. "Give it time," he said. They didn't understand immediately, but they felt it. Not heat, not at first, but the absence of loss. The way the warmth didn't slip away the moment the fire dimmed. The way the air didn't shift every time the wind struck the outside. And that was enough. The laughter stopped completely after that. Because the valley was running out of wood. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But enough to notice. And when a man begins to measure how many nights he has left instead of how much he has stored, something changes. That's when Harlan came. The same man who had once called the cabin a mud tomb. He didn't speak right away. He stepped inside, looked around, and stood still. The fire was small. The air was steady. The walls were thick and quiet. He turned to Caleb. "You're using less," he said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded once. Parlin glanced back at the door, at the storm pressing against it, then back at the walls. "How long can it hold?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the fire, adjusted a single piece of wood, then straightened. "Longer than the night," he said. Harlan absorbed that. Not fully, but enough. He didn't apologize. Didn't need to. Because the way he looked at the cabin now said everything. That night, more people stayed. Not all at once. Not crowded. But enough that the space felt different, quieter, heavier with understanding instead of doubt. They rotated. Came in, warmed, left. But they noticed something else. The more time passed, the less Caleb needed to feed the fire at all. Because the walls had already stored enough. By the time the worst of the storm arrived, a deep, crushing cold that settled over the valley like a weight, something had shifted completely. Other cabins struggled. Fires burned high, then died, then burned again. Men stayed awake through the night, fighting something they couldn't outpace. But Caleb didn't fight. He didn't need to. His cabin didn't lose heat fast enough to panic. It held, and that changed everything. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally passed, the valley looked worn. Snow lay deeper than before, pressing down on roofs, swallowing fences, reshaping paths. Some structures had taken damage. A few had been abandoned altogether. But Caleb's cabin stood exactly as it had before. Unchanged. Solid. Quiet. And now understood. People didn't laugh when they passed it anymore. They studied it. Carefully. Thoughtfully. Because once you see something work when everything else struggles, you don't forget it. The first rebuild started before the snow even began to melt. Not from Caleb. From the others. At first, small changes. Thicker ceiling between locks. Clay packed deeper into seams. Then more. Outer layers added. Walls built outward instead of just stacked inward. Not perfect. Not identical. But different. Learning takes time. But survival speeds it up. Caleb didn't stop them. Didn't claim anything. When they asked, he explained what mattered. Not how to copy it exactly, but how to think about it. Don't chase heat, he told them once. Keep it from leaving. That stayed with them. By the time the snow softened and the valley began to thaw, the place didn't look the same anymore. Not just from the storm, from what came after it. And when the next winter arrived, because it always did, the valley was ready in a way it hadn't been before. Not stronger, smarter. Fires burned lower. Cabins held longer. And across the land, you could see it. The change. Rounded edges. Thicker walls. Earth layered over wood. Not as extreme as Caleb's. But enough. Enough that when the cold returned, it didn't take as much from them. One evening, as the first snow of that new winter settled quietly over the valley, Willis stood beside Caleb outside the cabin. They watched smoke rise, not in desperation this time, but steady and controlled. "It's different now," Willis said. Caleb nodded slightly. The wind picked up, brushing snow across the hardened clay walls. It didn't stick. It slid. "They laughed at you," Willis added. Caleb looked out across the valley, then back at the cabin. "They needed to," he said. Willis frowned slightly. "Why?" Caleb's voice stayed calm. "Because they wouldn't have remembered otherwise." Willis didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because out there, across the snow-covered valley, the proof was already standing. And this time, nothing about it was funny.